everyone. I thought I'd just make a little short intro to this next section. So if you saw in the first part of this week that we really kind of debunked this idea that our ideas about gender and what we think of gender is rooted in biology. This section is about while biology, science shows that biology doesn't really play any significant role in gender, that doesn't mean biological arguments have not been used to define gender and specifically gender inequality. So let me share my screen to give you just a little heads up on what we're going to look at in this section, this sort of quote science of gender discrimination. So again, while we debunked the idea that there's any true biological root of our ideas about gender, that doesn't mean that science hasn't been used to justify gender inequality. And given that it's the 100th anniversary of the passage of the 19th Amendment, I thought we'd focus on how biology was used to resist giving women the right to vote. So I thought this quote was really interesting. Dr. Sedgwick in 1914 was a predominant professor at MIT, big fancy university on the East Coast. Quote, "Giving women the vote would mean a degeneration and a degradation of human fiber, which would turn back the hands of time 1,000 years. Hence it will probably never come, for mankind will not lightly abandon at the call of a few fanatics the hard-earned achievements of the ages." Wow, that says a lot right there. But what is he basing his resistance to allowing women the right to vote on? Well, Dr. Sedgwick, along with many other academics and quote scientists of the time, rooted their resistance to women's right to vote in the biology of women. So he wasn't alone. As I mentioned, academics, doctors, leading scientists of the time. This was not some right-wing sort of conspiracy theory, lurking in the dark corners. This was very mainstream public academic, argued that women shouldn't vote because they were quite literally not made for it, right? Science of the time, biology, anatomy, sociology, psychology, argued that the mental exertion could jeopardize women's reproductive health, right? The idea at the time was that bodies, both male and female bodies, had limited amounts of energy, and if women spent too much energy in their brain, for example, that would take away energy from their reproductive system and causing them to be infertile. So for those who opposed the suffrage movement in the US and Britain, which unfolded in tandem, right? This was definitely across the pond. Nearly every element of the female anatomy was seen as disqualifying them from the right to vote, starting, as I mentioned, with the brain. Here you have a picture of some anti-suffragette propaganda around with the idea that women's brain could literally only handle certain things, and those things are very much house and home, and allowing women to participate in the political process would literally be too taxing on their brain, right? So that's one example of quote biology being used to enforce gender inequality. Of course, menstruation was on the board as well, right? We've all heard this argument that, oh my gosh, if we give women too much power, political voice, they'll go crazy once a month as they have their period. So that was a really common argument used in the early 1900s as well. But what we have here is an example of how this argument is still relevant to today, right? On the right, you can see an op-ed letter written against the candidacy of Hillary Clinton, in part because, if you look down here at the bottom, they call us sexist just because we're critical of Hillary Clinton and her health, this person wrote. What if the time of month comes and she is sick at the same time, right? So this idea that somehow menstruation causes women to be too emotional and too irrational to not only vote, but to hold positions of political power, right? So again, another example of tying to biology to reinforce gender inequality. So one last example, another common refrain from women being allowed the right to vote was that their, quote, lack of physical strength. The argument was if women couldn't defend the nation physically, right, through physical force, they shouldn't be allowed to determine its policies with the ballot. So we'll go into all of these in a little bit more detail here on this page, but I just wanted to give you an overview of this sort of science of gender inequality. And again, the point that while biology, there is no sufficient biological explanation for gender, that doesn't mean biology hasn't been used to justify gender inequality. All right, looking forward to this week's conversation and how reflections on how these arguments are kind of still with us. All right, take care, everyone.